The air in Stonegate House had grown heavy, thick with the cloying scent of wilting lilies and the sharp, sterile smell of antiseptic. For a decade, this grand, cold mansion in the rolling hills outside Northwood had been Sophie Mercer's world, but it had never truly been her home. It was Josephine's, and now Josephine was leaving it. Sophie sat by the oversized mahogany bed, her hand resting gently on the frail, paper-thin skin of her mother-in-law's arm. The only sound in the cavernous room was the rhythmic, labored breathing of the dying woman and the solemn ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the final seconds of an era. Sophie had spent 10 years here as a devoted caregiver, companion, and confidant. She'd learned every nuance of Josephine's medication schedule, every food she could tolerate, every television program that brought a flicker of light to her tired eyes. She had read novels aloud until her voice was hoarse and held a cool cloth to Josephine's brow through countless fevered nights. In those quiet, shared moments, a bond had formed, deep and unspoken. Josephine, with her sharp mind dulled by illness, would sometimes have moments of startling clarity. Just last week, she had gripped Sophie's hand with surprising strength. "You're a good girl, Sophie," she had whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "A daughter. Don't let them ever tell you otherwise." In stark contrast were the visits from her husband, Charles. Charlie would breeze in once a week, if that, smelling of expensive cologne and impatience. He'd stand at the foot of the bed, his polished shoes tapping on the Persian rug, his eyes darting to the Rolex on his wrist. "Looking good, mother," he'd say, his voice too loud for the stillness of the room. He spoke of stock prices and real estate deals, never of memories or comfort. He never touched his mother, never saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes before they clouded over again. He saw only the matriarch of the Monroe fortune, an obstacle whose time was mercifully running out. Sophie would stand by, a silent witness to his callous detachment. Her own marriage to Charlie had withered years ago, devolving into a polite, hollow arrangement. She ran his house and cared for his mother. He provided a life of sterile luxury. He saw her not as a wife, but as a high-level employee, one he had grown tired of. Sophie knew it, felt it in the way he looked right through her, but she stayed for Josephine. She had made a promise, not to Charlie, but to the woman in the bed, that she would be there until the very end. As the weak afternoon sun slanted through the tall, mullioned windows, casting long shadows across the room, Sophie smoothed the blankets. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that came from a decade of suppressed emotions and selfless duty. The end was near, and with it, the terrifying uncertainty of her own future. The funeral was a blur of black suits, feigned sympathy, and hushed whispers about the size of the Monroe estate. 2 days later, the core family and a few key figures gathered in the library of Stonegate House. The room felt like a mausoleum, paneled in dark, imposing cherry wood, and lined with leather-bound books that looked as if they hadn't been opened in a century. A fine layer of dust coated everything, a testament to a life that had been solely focused upstairs in the sick room. Sophie sat in a hard-backed chair, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Across the vast mahogany table, Charlie sat with an air of practiced solemnity, but his knee jiggled with restless energy. Beside him, his executive assistant, Nicole Baker, sat with a notepad, her expression a perfect mask of professional concern that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. Martin Cole, the family's lawyer for 40 years, sat at the head of the table. He was a stoic, silver-haired man with a face etched by the secrets of the wealthy. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "We are gathered to execute the last will and testament of Josephine Monroe," he began, his voice a dry, emotionless monotone. He droned on, dispensing with the minor bequests first. A small but generous sum to the long-serving housekeeper. A painting to a distant cousin in Connecticut. A donation to the city's botanical garden. With each item read, the tension in the room coiled tighter. Sophie felt a knot forming in her stomach. She expected nothing. She had told herself that repeatedly. But a small, foolish part of her hoped for a mention, a small acknowledgement of her decade of service, of her genuine affection for Josephine. Finally, Mr. Cole reached the main body of the will. He paused, looking over the top of his spectacles at the assembled faces. Regarding the remainder of my estate, he read, including all properties, liquid assets, stocks, bonds, and controlling interest in Monroe Enterprises, I bequeath it, in its entirety, to my one and only son, Charles Monroe. A collective, silent exhale seemed to fill the room. Charlie's mask of grief finally slipped, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated triumph. He shot a quick, smug glance at Nicole, whose lips curved into a tiny, victorious smile. Sophie felt the floor drop out from beneath her. It wasn't the loss of the money. It was the brutal finality of her exclusion. 10 years of her life, erased in a single sentence. Josephine's whispered words, "A daughter. Don't let them tell you otherwise," echoed in her mind like a cruel joke. They had told her otherwise. In the stark, unfeeling language of the law, she was nothing. She was just the nurse. As soon as Martin Cole had formally concluded the reading, the distant cousins and other attendees offered their terse, awkward condolences to Charlie and filed out of the library, their purpose for being there fulfilled. The heavy oak door clicked shut, plunging the room into an intimate, suffocating silence. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The veneer of civility evaporated, replaced by something sharp and predatory. Charlie stood up, stretching as if shaking off a long, tedious performance. He walked over to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a generous measure of whiskey. Nicole Baker rose and stood beside him, placing a possessive hand on his arm. "Well," Charlie said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "That's that." He turned to face Sophie. His eyes, so like his mother's but devoid of any of her warmth, were cold and dismissive. "Don't look so glum, Sophie. You got a front row seat to the good life for a decade, more than a girl like you could have ever hoped for." The cruelty was so casual, so effortless, it stole the air from Sophie's lungs. She could only stare at him, her heart pounding a dull, painful rhythm against her ribs. He took a sip of his whiskey and sneered. "My mother is gone." "Your services," he said, gesturing around the room, at the house, at her entire life, "are no longer required." He set the glass down with a sharp clink. "I'm leaving you." The words hung in the air, clinical and final. He then gestured to the woman clinging to his arm. "Nicole and I are together. We have been for some time. It's time for me to be with someone who is my equal, someone who can contribute more to my life than just someone who is fluffing pillows." Nicole's smile was all teeth. She looked Sophie up and down, her gaze lingering on the simple, inexpensive dress, a silent judgment that screamed inadequate. The humiliation was a physical force, a cold wave that washed over Sophie, leaving her numb. This was his plan all along. He had been waiting, patiently, for his mother to die so he could discard his dutiful wife like an old coat. "You were just her nurse," he spat, the words dripping with venom. "That's all you ever were. You were never family." That was the blow that shattered her. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was an annihilation of her identity, of the love she had felt for Josephine, of the sacrifices she had made. She stood up on trembling legs, her dignity the only thing she had left. "The divorce papers will be sent to your mother's," he added, a final petty twist of the knife. "Have your things out by tomorrow." Sophie didn't say a word. She simply turned and walked out of the library, each step an excruciating effort to keep from falling apart. Sophie moved through the grand halls of Stonegate House like a ghost. The portraits of Monroe ancestors lining the walls seemed to watch her with cold, indifferent eyes. The house, which had been the backdrop to her entire adult life, now felt alien and hostile, its opulence a mockery of her desolation. In her and Charlie's bedroom, no, just Charlie's bedroom now, she pulled a small duffel bag from the back of the walk-in closet. She packed methodically, numbly. A few changes of clothes, her toiletries, the worn paperback she'd been reading at Josephine's bedside. She left behind the designer clothes Charlie had bought her, the jewelry, all the trappings of a life that was never truly hers. It all felt like a costume, and the play was over. With the light bag in her hand, she walked down the sweeping main staircase for the last time. Her footsteps echoed in the cavernous foyer. She was preparing to walk out the front door with nothing but a bag of clothes and a decade of her life reduced to a painful memory. She was just steps from the massive, carved oak door when a quiet voice stopped her. "Mrs. Monroe." She turned. Martin Cole was standing in the archway of a small parlor, his expression uncharacteristically strained. "A moment, if you please." He beckoned her into the small, sunlit room, away from the main hall. He closed the doors behind them, creating a pocket of privacy. "Sophie," he said, using her first name for the first time she could remember. "I wish to offer my sincerest condolences. Not for Josephine's passing, which was a mercy, but for the deplorable behavior you were just subjected to. Josephine would have been ashamed of her son today." The unexpected kindness made Sophie's eyes well with tears she had refused to shed in front of Charlie. She just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Mr. Cole reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a circle of dark blue wax, imprinted with the Monroe family crest. On the front, in Josephine's elegant, spidery script, were 2 lines. "For Sophie. Only for Sophie. Josephine entrusted this to me over a year ago," Mr. Cole explained, his voice low and serious. "Her instructions were explicit. I was to give it to you, and only you, after the primary will was read and executed. She was a very shrewd woman." He placed the heavy envelope in Sophie's hands. It felt impossibly weighty. "Whatever is in that letter," he said, meeting her gaze, "is between you and her. A final piece of business the rest of the world has no right to." Sophie looked down at the letter, her name written in the hand of the only person in this family who had ever truly seen her. For the first time since walking out of the library, a tiny fragile flicker of something other than despair ignited within her. Sophie didn't open the letter at Stonegate House. She couldn't. The estate felt contaminated by Charlie's cruelty, and she knew instinctively that whatever Josephine had left her deserved to be read in a neutral space, a place that belonged only to her. She drove her modest sedan into the heart of Northwood and found a quiet corner table in a bustling coffee shop. The aroma of roasted coffee beans and the low murmur of strangers' conversations felt like a shield, insulating her from the raw, echoing silence of her collapsed life. With trembling fingers, she carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written on Josephine's personal watermarked stationery. Sophie unfolded it and began to read. "My dearest Sophie," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and my fool of a son has behaved exactly as I feared he would. Please, do not mistake the words read from my official will as my true feelings. They were a necessary cruelty, and for that, I am truly sorry. It was a performance, my dear, and you were the most important member of the audience." Sophie's breath hitched. She read on, the words on the page a balm on her wounded soul. Josephine wrote of her son's greed, his coldness, a character flaw she had seen in him since he was a boy. She confessed that she had known about his affairs, his simmering resentment, his impatience for her to be gone. "I saw him look at you, Sophie. He saw a servant, but I saw a daughter. You gave me your time, your kindness, your heart, when my own blood was merely waiting for my heart to stop beating. That is a debt that no amount of money can ever repay, but it is a debt I will not leave unsettled." The letter went on to explain the public will. It was a strategy, a way to make Charlie feel secure, invincible, a way to ensure he would reveal his true, monstrous nature to her without reservation. He needed to believe he had won everything, so he would feel no need to hide. "Now you know the man you married, and now you will have the means to deal with him." Near the end of the letter, Josephine's handwriting grew slightly shakier. Taped to the back of this last page is a key. It does not open a door in that house. It opens your future. Follow the instructions I gave Martin. He knows what to do. Be brave, my dear girl. Your new life starts now. Sophie turned the last page over. Taped securely to the thick vellum was a small, old-fashioned brass key, heavy and ornate. She curled her fingers around it, the metal cool against her skin. The tears that finally fell were not tears of grief or humiliation. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude for a woman whose love and foresight had reached beyond the grave to save her. The next morning, armed with Josephine's letter and a newfound sense of purpose, Sophie met Martin Cole at his downtown Northwood office. He greeted her with a warm, respectful nod and led her not to his main office, but to his car. "The instructions lead us to a bank in the city," he explained as they drove. Josephine was nothing if not thorough. They arrived at a formidable, old-world institution with marble floors and brass teller cages, a place that exuded quiet, unshakable wealth. Mr. Cole led her to the lower level, to the vault for the safe deposit boxes. He presented his own identification and a legal document from Josephine, and Sophie presented the key. A bank officer, using his own master key in conjunction with hers, unlocked a long, narrow box registered not to Josephine Monroe, but to a Cedar Crest Holdings LLC, a shell corporation Sophie had never heard of. The officer slid the metal container out and placed it on a table in a private viewing room, leaving Sophie and Mr. Cole alone. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the lid. For a moment, she could only stare. The box was filled with neat stacks of bearer bonds, anonymous and untraceable, totaling a sum that made her head spin. It was a fortune, enough to live on for the rest of her life in complete comfort. It was more than she could have ever imagined, but that wasn't the most important thing in the box. Tucked beneath the bonds was a simple, leather-bound ledger. Sophie lifted it out. It felt heavy, significant. She opened it to the first page. In Josephine's meticulous, steady hand, an entirely different story of the Monroe family finances was laid bare. For years, Josephine had been tracking her son's activities. The ledger was a devastatingly detailed account of Charlie's embezzlement from Monroe Enterprises. There were dates, transfer amounts, and account numbers for offshore banks. Tucked between the pages were supporting documents, photocopied bank statements, printouts of incriminating emails Charlie thought were deleted, and notes on suspicious business deals where he had siphoned company funds for personal projects. It was a masterpiece of quiet, patient investigation. Josephine had known for years that her son was a thief. She had watched him steal from her, from the company their family had built for generations, and she had recorded every single transgression. Sophie finally understood the full, brilliant scope of Josephine's plan. The money was a gift, a way to ensure her security. But the ledger was a weapon. It was justice. It was the power to not just survive Charlie, but to ruin him completely. In that quiet, sterile viewing room, Sophie Mercer, the dismissed nurse, the discarded wife, felt a core of steel form within her. The grieving was over. The reckoning was about to begin. When Sophie walked back through the front doors of Stonegate House that afternoon, she was a different woman from the one who had fled in shame just 24 hours earlier. Her posture was straight. Her steps were measured and confident. The oppressive weight of the house no longer affected her. She was merely an actor returning to the stage for the final act. She followed the sound of loud, triumphant music to the grand sunroom overlooking the gardens. The scene inside was grotesque. Charlie and Nicole were there, surrounded by open bottles of champagne. An interior designer was gesturing wildly at the walls, talking about a more modern aesthetic, while Charlie nodded in agreement, a possessive arm draped around Nicole's shoulders. They were gleefully planning the erasure of Josephine's memory from the very house she had built. Their laughter was jarring, a violation of the recent grief. "What the hell are you doing here?" Charlie demanded when he saw her, his face twisting into an ugly scowl. "I told you to be gone by today." The interior designer froze, sensing the sudden shift in temperature. Sophie ignored him. She walked calmly to the glass coffee table, her gaze level and cold. "Get out!" Charlie snarled, reaching for his phone, likely to call security. "I'm not finished speaking with you, Charles," Sophie said, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority that made him pause. She reached into the portfolio she was carrying and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't the ledger. That was far too precious. It was a clean, crisp copy of one bank statement. She placed it on the table in front of him. "Cayman Islands," she said softly. "The Aurelius Investment Group, a shell company. This transfer of $250,000 from Monroe Enterprises' operating budget happened on March 14th. The day you told your mother the company needed to tighten its belt and suspend her physical therapy?" Charlie stared at the paper, the blood draining from his face. The color of the ink seemed to mock him. Where did you get this? He stammered, his bravado crumbling into dust. Nicole's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed panic as she looked from the paper to Charlie's ashen face. That's just one page, Charlie, Sophie continued, her voice as smooth and cold as ice. I have the whole book, years of it. Every secret account, every fraudulent invoice, every dollar you stole from your own mother while I was holding her hand. She let the words hang in the air, watching as the full weight of his predicament crushed him. The man who had sneered that she was just a nurse was now staring at her as if she were his executioner. She held all the power, and they both knew it. The celebration was over. Panic gave way to pathetic, blustering threats. You can't prove anything, Charlie spat, trying to regain some semblance of control, but his voice trembled. This is libel. I'll sue you for everything you have. You mean the clothes in my duffel bag? Sophie replied, her voice devoid of emotion. You can have them, but you should know, I'm not the only one who has this information. She let that sink in. Your mother was very thorough. She left a second sealed copy of the entire ledger with Martin Cole. His instructions are to deliver it to the district attorney and the Securities and Exchange Commission upon my word. Or, of course, if anything unfortunate were to happen to me. The finality in her tone extinguished the last spark of fight in him. He collapsed into a chair, a broken man. Nicole, seeing her golden ticket turning to ash, quietly backed away and slipped out of the room without a word, abandoning the sinking ship. Sophie looked down at the pathetic shell of the man who had humiliated her. She felt no pity, only a cold sense of justice. You have two paths, Charlie, she stated, laying out his future as clinically as he had laid out hers. Path A. I make a phone call. You face federal fraud and embezzlement charges. The press will have a field day with the story of the man who stole from his dying mother. You will go to prison, and every legitimate asset you have will be clawed back to pay for your crimes. She paused, letting him envision the public ruin, the orange jumpsuit. Or Path B, she continued. You will sign over 60% of the legitimate inheritance, the money you didn't steal, to a new trust. You will also sign a legally binding document ceding any and all claims to Monroe Enterprises. Then you will disappear. You will leave Northwood and you will never, ever contact me again. He stared at her, his mouth agape. He was utterly, completely defeated. There was no choice at all. He nodded weakly, the only response he could manage. 6 months later, Sophie Mercer stood on a small stage under a bright autumn sky. She was no longer in a simple dress, but a sharp professional suit. Behind her, a large banner read, Groundbreaking Ceremony for the Josephine Monroe Center for Community Care. Using the fortune Josephine had left her, and the restitution she had extracted from Charlie, she had established a foundation to provide hospice care, family support, and elder services to those who couldn't afford it. Martin Cole stood in the front row, beaming with pride. As Sophie stepped up to the podium and looked out at the supportive faces of the community, she felt a profound peace. She had not only reclaimed her own life, but had transformed Charlie's greed and cruelty into a legacy of compassion. She was no longer a nurse or a wife. She was Sophie Mercer, and she was finally home.